The photograph you're seeing right now was taken by a stunned paparazzi photographer named Alan Berliner on December 28, 1984, at approximately 2:23 p.m. That's Frank Sinatra, 79 years old, one of the most powerful men in entertainment history, sitting completely alone in the back seat of his black limousine. The location, the parking area of Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles, exactly 50 yards away from Peter Lawford's funeral. And Frank Sinatra never got out of the car. Berliner later described what he witnessed in an interview with the Los Angeles Times. "I thought he was waiting for the crowd to thin out before making his entrance. That's what celebrities do. They time it for maximum impact. But then 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15, and I realized he wasn't going in. He was just sitting there, staring at the funeral through the windshield. For 37 minutes, Frank Sinatra sat in that vehicle, with his hand repeatedly gripping and releasing the door handle, watching as one of his closest friends, a man who had stood beside him during the greatest years of his life, was buried. The man who introduced him to John F. Kennedy. The man who partied with him in Las Vegas until dawn. The man who helped create the Rat Pack, the most legendary group of entertainers in American history. And Frank Sinatra chose not to walk those final 50 yards. This isn't a story about a funeral. This is the story of the most brutal, unforgiving grudge in Hollywood history. A betrayal so deep, so personal, that Frank Sinatra chose revenge over reconciliation, even when his friend was being lowered into the ground. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand why Frank made that choice, and why, in his mind, Peter Lawford deserved exactly what he got. To understand the man sitting in that limousine, you have to go back to 1958, back when Peter Lawford wasn't just Frank Sinatra's friend. He was family. Peter Lawford was born into British aristocracy, the son of Lieutenant General Sir Sidney Lawford, a decorated war hero. He'd been a contract player at MGM since the 1940s, appearing in films like Easter Parade, Little Women, and Good News. He was handsome, charming, and had that polished British elegance that Hollywood loved. But Peter's real value to Frank wasn't his acting talent or his aristocratic pedigree, it was his connections. In 1954, Peter Lawford married Patricia Kennedy, the sister of a young ambitious senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy. Overnight, Peter wasn't just another Hollywood actor, he was a Kennedy. He had direct access to political power that most entertainers could only fantasize about, and Frank Sinatra noticed immediately. By 1958, Frank had assembled what would become known as the Rat Pack. Himself, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford. They weren't just performers, they were a cultural phenomenon that defined an entire era. They filmed Ocean's 11 during the day and performed at the Sands Hotel at night. They drank, gambled, and lived like modern-day kings in a Las Vegas that belonged to them. The chemistry was electric. Dean was the laid-back drunk. Sammy was the supremely talented underdog. Joey was the comedian. Peter was the sophisticated British gentleman. And Frank was the ringleader, the chairman of the board who controlled everything. But Peter Lawford had something the others didn't. He could pick up a phone and reach the future president of the United States, and Frank wanted that access desperately. See, Frank Sinatra had always craved legitimacy. Yes, he was one of the biggest stars in the world. Yes, he'd won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity. Yes, he could sell out any venue on the planet, and had teenage girls fainting at his concerts. But there was always a shadow over him. The whispers about his mob connections, the rumors about Sam Giancana and the Chicago outfit, the persistent questions about how a scrappy kid from Hoboken rose so far so fast. Frank thought that if he could get close to Kennedy, if he could become the president's personal friend and confidant, it would erase all of that. It would prove that Frank Sinatra wasn't just a mobbed-up singer from New Jersey. He was a legitimate American icon who deserved respect from the establishment. So Frank cultivated that relationship through Peter with almost obsessive intensity. He hosted massive fundraisers for JFK's 1960 presidential campaign, pulling in hundreds of thousands of dollars. He recruited the entire Hollywood establishment to support Kennedy. He even commissioned a special version of High Hopes as JFK's campaign song, performed it at rallies, and turned it into an anthem. And when Kennedy won in November 1960, defeating Richard Nixon in one of the closest elections in American history, Frank felt like he'd won too. Peter Lawford was the bridge that made it all possible, and for a while, for those golden years between 1960 and 1962, it seemed like their friendship was unbreakable. They spent weekends together at Frank's compound in Palm Springs, lounging by the pool and discussing politics, women, and the future of America. They threw legendary parties where movie stars mingled with senators, where Marilyn Monroe danced with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, where the lines between Hollywood and Washington dissolved completely. Peter once joked to a reporter from Life magazine, "Frank doesn't have friends, he has brothers, and I'm one of them." That was true until March 1962. Frank Sinatra was preparing for the biggest moment of his life. President John F. Kennedy was going to stay at his home. Frank's Palm Springs compound wasn't just a house. It was a statement of power. Sprawling across several acres in the California desert, it featured multiple guest bungalows, a massive swimming pool shaped like a grand piano, tennis courts, a private screening room, and a main house that could comfortably host dozens of guests in absolute luxury. But when Frank found out that JFK was planning a West Coast trip in March, he went into absolute overdrive. He built a helipad specifically designed to accommodate Marine One, the presidential helicopter. He installed a dedicated phone line with secure encryption for presidential communications, the same technology used in the White House. He added an entire wing to the main house, with extra bedrooms equipped with bulletproof glass and security features that would satisfy the Secret Service. He even had a massive flagpole erected so the presidential flag could fly when JFK was in residence. Frank spent an estimated $250,000 on these renovations, over $2.5 million in today's money, all for a single presidential visit. He bragged about it constantly. He showed Dean Martin the new helipad, pointing out how the concrete was reinforced to handle the helicopter's weight. He told Sammy about the secure phone lines. He was like a kid preparing for the biggest party of his life, unable to contain his excitement. And then in late February 1962, Peter Lawford received a phone call that would destroy everything. The call came from Attorney General Robert Kennedy, JFK's younger brother and closest advisor. Bobby Kennedy delivered a message that was simple and devastating. President Kennedy would not be staying at Frank Sinatra's home during his California trip. Instead, JFK would stay at Bing Crosby's estate in nearby Palm Desert. The reason? FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had presented the Kennedys with a detailed, extensively documented report on Frank Sinatra's connections to organized crime, specifically his ongoing relationship with Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana. Hoover told the Kennedys in stark terms that if the President of the United States stayed at Sinatra's compound, it would be a political disaster of epic proportions. The press would crucify them, the Republicans would use it as ammunition for years, congressional investigations would be launched. It couldn't happen, it wouldn't happen, and Bobby Kennedy, always the pragmatic political strategist, agreed immediately. But someone had to tell Frank Sinatra that his entire world was crumbling, and that job, that impossible career-destroying job, fell to Peter Lawford. Peter was trapped in an impossible position. On one side was his brother-in-law, the President of the United States, and the most powerful political family in American history. On the other side was Frank Sinatra, a man known throughout Hollywood for his volcanic temper, his fierce sense of loyalty, and his absolute intolerance for betrayal. Peter tried to soften the blow. He called Frank and said he needed to come by the compound to talk about the presidential visit. Frank, thinking Peter was coming to finalize security details or discuss the menu for the state dinner, was excited and welcoming. When Peter arrived at the compound on March 5, 1962, Frank was standing on his brand new helipad, proudly showing off the presidential seal he'd had painted on the concrete. And that's when Peter delivered the news. Accounts of what happened next vary depending on who's telling the story, but everyone agrees on the essentials. Frank Sinatra absolutely exploded. He screamed at Peter at the top of his lungs. He called him a traitor, a coward, a Kennedy puppet. He accused him of choosing political convenience over their friendship, of selling out for access to power. Peter tried desperately to explain that it wasn't his decision, that Bobby Kennedy had made the call, that the FBI had forced their hand, that there was literally nothing Peter could do to change it. But Frank didn't want to hear explanations. He didn't want to hear excuses. In Frank's mind, Peter should have fought for him. Peter should have stood up to Bobby Kennedy and said, "Frank Sinatra delivered Hollywood for your brother's campaign. He raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. He put his reputation on the line, and you're going to humiliate him like this? No, find another solution." Instead, Peter had simply delivered the message like an obedient Kennedy family messenger boy, and Frank would never, ever forgive him for it. After Peter left, fleeing the compound in tears, Frank grabbed a sledgehammer from his garage and went to work. He personally destroyed the helipad he'd built for Kennedy, smashing the concrete with brutal, methodical strikes. He was crying and screaming as he worked, his white shirt soaked with sweat. He ripped up the metal landing lights with his bare hands. He tore out the presidential flagpole. He had workers come in and remove the secure phone lines, literally cutting the wires with bolt cutters. George Jacobs, Frank's longtime valet, who witnessed the entire meltdown, later recalled in his memoir, "I'd never seen him that angry in all my years working for him, and I'd seen Frank angry plenty of times. But this was different. He was crying and screaming and destroying everything he'd built. It wasn't just about the president canceling, it was about Peter. Frank felt like Peter had stabbed him in the back, like Peter had chosen the Kennedys over him, and in Frank's world, that was unforgivable. Within 24 hours, Frank Sinatra made an irrevocable decision. Peter Lawford was dead to him. Not just fired, not just excluded, dead. Frank Sinatra didn't just end his friendship with Peter Lawford, he systematically, methodically erased him from existence. Peter had been cast in Robin and the Seven Hoods, a Rat Pack film that was already deep into pre-production with costumes fitted and scenes blocked out. Frank personally had the entire script rewritten to remove Peter's character completely, and in a move of calculated cruelty, he brought in Bing Crosby to replace him, the exact same Bing Crosby whose house JFK had chosen to stay at instead of Frank's. The message couldn't have been clearer. Even the man who humiliated Frank was more welcome than Peter Lawford. When Peter called Frank's private line to apologize, to explain, to beg for a chance to salvage their friendship, Frank had his number blocked. When Peter sent letters, they were returned unopened. When Peter showed up at the Sands Hotel during a Rat Pack performance, desperately hoping to talk to Frank face to face, Frank had casino security physically remove him from the building and ban him from the property. Dean Martin, Frank's closest friend and the most laid-back member of the Rat Pack, tried to intervene. Dean told Frank privately that the grudge had gone too far, that Peter was visibly suffering, that everyone made mistakes and deserved forgiveness. Frank's response was ice cold and final. He made his choice when he chose the Kennedys over me. Now he lives with it. And if you keep bringing this up, you'll make a choice too. Even Sammy Davis Jr., who quite literally owed his entire career to Frank's support during an era when interracial performers faced brutal discrimination, tried to talk Frank down. Sammy invited Peter to his performances, hoping that if Frank saw Peter in a neutral setting, he might soften. Frank stopped speaking to Sammy for 6 months as punishment. He cancelled Sammy's appearances at the Sands. He pulled strings to have Sammy dropped from television appearances. The message was brutal and clear. If you sided with Peter Lawford, you were choosing against Frank Sinatra, and in 1960s Hollywood, that was a professional death sentence. But here's the truly devastating part of this story. Peter Lawford didn't even get to keep the Kennedys. In November 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and everything changed. Bobby Kennedy, consumed by grief and increasingly paranoid conspiracy theories, began to pull away from Peter. Bobby blamed Peter for introducing Marilyn Monroe to JFK, a relationship that had become a massive political liability in the months before Marilyn's suspicious death in August 1962. By 1966, Patricia Kennedy filed for divorce from Peter, citing his escalating alcoholism, serial infidelity, and inability to hold down steady work. The Kennedy family cut Peter off completely and brutally. He was no longer invited to family weddings, funerals, or holiday gatherings, no longer included in political strategy sessions, no longer welcome at Hyannis Port. The access that had made him valuable to Frank Sinatra, and had ultimately cost him Frank's friendship, was completely gone. Peter Lawford had lost everything that mattered. His film career collapsed almost overnight. Without the Rat Pack connection, and without the Kennedy name opening doors, Peter couldn't get serious roles. The offers that had once poured in from major studios dried up completely. By the early 1970s, Peter was reduced to doing embarrassing guest spots on television game shows and low-budget European films, a pathetic fall from his days as a Hollywood leading man. His finances disintegrated. The divorce from Patricia cost him most of his accumulated wealth. He married 3 more times in increasingly desperate attempts to find stability, and each marriage ended in expensive divorces that drained what little money he had left. By 1975, Peter had filed for bankruptcy, listing debts of over $500,000, and then there were the substances that slowly killed him. Peter had always enjoyed drinking. That was simply part of Rat Pack culture. But after losing Frank and the Kennedys, the drinking transformed into something much darker and more destructive. He added pills to the mix, painkillers, sleeping pills, tranquilizers, anything to numb the unbearable reality of what his life had become. Friends from that era remember Peter as a walking ghost. He would show up uninvited at Hollywood parties, clearly intoxicated, desperately trying to relive the glory days. He would corner younger actors and bore them with endless stories about Frank and the Rat Pack, about JFK and Marilyn, about the legendary nights at the Sands when he was somebody important. People pitied him, and pity is worse than hatred in Hollywood. In 1981, Peter appeared on a daytime talk show, and the host asked him about Frank Sinatra. Peter's face crumpled. He said, his voice breaking, "I miss him every single day. I miss my friend. I made a mistake. Or maybe I didn't even make a mistake. Maybe I was just caught in an impossible situation. But either way, I've paid for it every single day for almost 20 years. A reporter showed Frank the clip and asked point blank if he'd consider reconciling with Peter after hearing that. Frank's response was chilling. "I don't know who you're talking about." On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1984, Peter Lawford suffered a massive heart attack in his small, cluttered apartment in West Los Angeles. Paramedics rushed him to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but doctors couldn't save him. He was pronounced dead at 11:47 p.m. He was 61 years old. The official cause of death listed on the death certificate was cardiac arrest, but the full coroner's report told a much grimmer story. Decades of chronic alcohol abuse, severe liver damage, kidney failure, acute malnutrition. Peter Lawford's body had simply given up after years of systematic self-destruction. When news of Peter's death broke on Christmas morning, Hollywood reacted with genuine shock, not because Peter had died,
but because so many people had simply assumed he was already dead. That's how completely he'd fallen from public consciousness. The funeral was scheduled for December 28th at Westwood Memorial Park, the same cemetery where Marilyn Monroe was buried. It would be a small private service. Peter's fourth wife, Patricia Seton, a woman he'd married just months earlier, handled the sparse arrangements. In the days leading up to the funeral, entertainment reporters began calling Frank Sinatra's office and personal representatives, asking the question everyone wanted answered: would Frank Sinatra attend Peter Lawford's funeral? Frank's longtime publicist issued a terse, carefully worded no comment. Dean Martin, who had quietly maintained contact with Peter over the years despite Frank's prohibition, announced he would definitely attend. Sammy Davis Jr., now battling throat cancer and barely able to perform, said he would try his best to make it. But everyone in Hollywood wanted to know, after 22 years of the most brutal grudge in entertainment history, would Frank Sinatra finally forgive Peter Lawford in death?
On the morning of December 28th, Frank was at his private compound in Rancho Mirage, about 2 hours from Los Angeles. According to his daughter Nancy Sinatra, who later wrote about this day in her memoir, Frank spent the entire morning locked in his office, smoking cigarettes and staring out the window at the desert. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't eat breakfast. He just sat there, alone with his thoughts. At around noon, Frank emerged from his office and told his driver to prepare the car. He didn't say where they were going, didn't explain his plans, but everyone in the household knew exactly what was happening. The funeral began promptly at 2 p.m. Approximately 40 people attended, a pathetically, heartbreakingly small number for a man who had once been Hollywood royalty. Dean Martin was there, looking absolutely devastated, barely able to stand. A handful of actors from Peter's MGM contract days showed up out of loyalty to the past. Patricia Seton sat in the front row, weeping quietly. At 2:17 p.m., witnesses reported seeing a black limousine with tinted windows pull slowly into the cemetery's parking area, but the car didn't proceed toward the funeral site like normal arrivals. Instead, it parked approximately 50 yards away, near a service road, positioned with a clear, unobstructed view of the grave. Paparazzi photographer Alan Berliner was stationed near the cemetery entrance, hoping to capture photographs of celebrity mourners for the tabloids. When he saw the limousine arrive, he assumed it was just another late guest and didn't pay much attention. But then the car simply sat there, engine idling, not moving. Berliner raised his camera, equipped with a powerful telephoto lens, and focused on the vehicle. Through the slightly tinted rear window, he could clearly see Frank Sinatra sitting alone in the back seat, wearing a dark suit and aviator sunglasses, his face turned directly toward the funeral. Berliner later described the moment in vivid detail to the Los Angeles Times. "At first I genuinely thought he was just waiting for the service to finish so he could pay his respects privately, away from the crowd. That's what major celebrities often do. They time their arrivals to avoid the press and the spectacle. But then 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15, and I suddenly realized with absolute certainty he wasn't going to get out. He was just sitting there, watching Peter's funeral from inside his car. For 37 excruciating minutes, Frank Sinatra sat motionless in that vehicle. Multiple witnesses, including other photographers and late arriving mourners, described seeing Frank's hand repeatedly reach for the door handle, gripping it tightly, holding it for several seconds, then slowly releasing it, like he was fighting an intense internal war between the part of him that wanted desperately to attend and the part that absolutely refused to forgive. At one point, around 2:35 p.m., Frank's driver got out of the car and walked around to the rear passenger door. He leaned down and appeared to be speaking to Frank through the window, clearly asking if he wanted to exit the vehicle and attend the funeral. Frank shook his head and waved the driver away. The brief service concluded at 2:47 p.m. Peter Lawford's simple casket was slowly lowered into the ground. Dean Martin stood at the grave's edge, openly weeping, his shoulders shaking. The small group of mourners began to quietly disperse, heading back to their cars. And still, Frank Sinatra sat completely motionless in his limousine. At exactly 2:54 p.m., as the last mourners were walking away from the grave, Frank's limousine finally began to move. It drove slowly, almost painfully slowly, past the gravesite, close enough that Frank could have easily stopped, gotten out, and walked over in less than 30 seconds. But he didn't stop. The car kept moving. Alan Berliner, positioned with his camera, managed to capture one crystal-clear photograph in those final moments. Frank Sinatra visible through the car window, hand frozen on the door handle, his face turned directly toward Peter Lawford's fresh grave, captured in that singular moment of agonizing decision. That photograph would become one of the most haunting, psychologically revealing images in Hollywood history. Frank Sinatra never publicly commented on Peter Lawford's death. Not a single word. He didn't issue a statement of condolence. He didn't send flowers to the grave. He didn't make a charitable donation in Peter's name. He didn't reach out privately to Peter's widow or his children. Complete, absolute silence. In Frank's mind, Peter Lawford had committed the unforgivable sin back in March 1962. He had chosen political expediency over personal loyalty, and that betrayal carried permanent, eternal consequences. But here's where the story becomes infinitely more complicated, because the brutal truth is, Peter Lawford didn't really have a choice. Think carefully about the impossible position Peter was trapped in. His brother-in-law was the President of the United States. The Attorney General of the United States, Bobby Kennedy, one of the most powerful men in the country, had personally called Peter and delivered an unambiguous order. JFK would not stay at Frank Sinatra's house. This wasn't a polite request open to negotiation. This was a direct command from the Kennedy family. What exactly was Peter supposed to do? Refuse to deliver the message and watch his marriage to Patricia Kennedy collapse? Tell the President of the United States that Frank Sinatra's friendship was more important than avoiding a national political scandal? Risk being completely cut off from the Kennedy family, the source of all his political connections and social status? Peter was caught between two absolutely immovable forces, the Kennedys and Frank Sinatra, and there was literally no way to satisfy both of them simultaneously. He chose to deliver the message because he genuinely believed, naively, as it turned out, that Frank would understand that Peter was just the messenger, that Peter didn't make this decision, that the FBI and the Kennedys had made it, and Peter was simply the unfortunate person tasked with communicating it. But Frank didn't see it that way at all. In Frank's rigid worldview, loyalty was absolute and unconditional. If you were Frank's friend, if you were his brother, you fought for him against everyone, including presidents and attorney generals. You didn't deliver devastating news with a sad apology. You refused to participate in betraying him, even if it cost you everything. And this uncompromising worldview came directly from a lifetime of betrayals that had systematically shaped Frank Sinatra into the emotionally scarred man sitting in that limousine. Frank had been brutally betrayed by Columbia Records in 1952, when they unceremoniously dropped him at the absolute lowest point of his career, when his voice was failing and the hits had stopped coming. He'd been betrayed by Ivor Gardner, the love of his life, who left him despite his desperate, humiliating pleas for her to stay. He'd been betrayed by the Hollywood establishment that had quietly blacklisted him for his outspoken political views and persistent mob connections. So when the Kennedys rejected him in 1962, using Peter Lawford as their messenger, Frank saw it as just another betrayal in an endless series of people who had used him, taken what they needed, and then discarded him without a second thought. But here's the cruelest, most devastating irony of this entire story. Frank's 22-year grudge against Peter Lawford accomplished absolutely nothing positive. It didn't hurt the Kennedys in any meaningful way. JFK was assassinated just 18 months later. Bobby was murdered in 1968. The Kennedy family barely even noticed that Frank had cut off Peter Lawford. He was just a minor casualty in their much larger political dynasty. It didn't restore Frank's reputation or erase the mob connections. The rumors about Sam Giancana and the Chicago outfit never went away. Frank would spend the entire rest of his life, another 36 years, fighting persistent allegations about his organized crime ties. All the grudge accomplished was the complete destruction of Peter Lawford's life and career, and the exposure of something genuinely dark and unforgiving in Frank Sinatra's character. Because sitting in that limousine on December 28, 1984, 50 yards from Peter's grave, Frank had one final choice to make. He could walk over to that grave and publicly acknowledge that Peter had been trapped in an impossible situation back in 1962, that Peter had suffered more than enough over 22 years of brutal exile, that the punishment had grotesquely exceeded the crime, or he could hold on to the grudge. He could let his pride, his anger, and his need for revenge be stronger than his grief, his compassion, or his capacity for forgiveness, and Frank chose the grudge. In May 1998, when Frank Sinatra died at age 82 from a heart attack, his funeral was a massive historic event covered by every major news organization in the world. Former presidents attended, Hollywood royalty packed the church, the governor of California gave a eulogy. Dean Martin had died the year before, but if he'd been alive, he absolutely would have been there. People eulogized Frank as an American legend, a cultural icon, a man of fierce, unwavering loyalty to his friends and family, but Peter Lawford's name was never mentioned once during the entire service. That photograph of Frank Sinatra sitting alone in his limousine on December 28, 1984, tells you everything you need to know about who Frank Sinatra really was beneath all the legend and mythology. Not the carefully constructed public image, not the romanticized icon of American music. The actual man. Frank Sinatra was genuinely capable of extraordinary generosity. He gave millions of dollars to charity throughout his lifetime. He personally stood up for Sammy Davis Jr. when the entire country was violently opposed to interracial relationships and marriages. He quietly supported friends who were broke or struggling, often paying their bills without ever telling anyone. But Frank Sinatra was also capable of extraordinary, calculated cruelty. and when he decided, rightly or wrongly, that you had betrayed him, there was no forgiveness, no second chances, no mercy, no compassion, just permanent exile. Peter Lawford spent the final 22 years of his life desperately trying to apologize for something that genuinely wasn't his fault. He lost his career, his family, his fortune, his dignity, his health, all because he delivered a message from the President of the United States. And Frank Sinatra sat 50 yards away from his funeral, hand gripping and releasing the door handle, and ultimately chose revenge over compassion. Some people claim Frank regretted it later, that in his final years, when his own health was rapidly failing and he was losing friends to age and illness, he privately expressed remorse about how he treated Peter. But there's no credible evidence of that. No apology was ever issued, no acknowledgement was ever made, no flowers ever appeared on Peter's grave. What we know with absolute certainty is this: Frank Sinatra had 37 minutes to make a choice, 37 minutes to walk 50 yards and offer forgiveness to a man who had already suffered far more than enough, and he chose to drive away. That's the real, unvarnished legacy of Frank Sinatra, not just the legendary music that defined generations, not just the iconic movies, not just the carefully curated public image. It's the human wreckage he left behind, and the grudges he consciously chose over grace. Now here's the thing, this story about Peter Lawford's funeral, it's just one chapter in the dark, psychologically complex truth about Frank Sinatra's life. Most people only know the carefully sanitized version, the chairman of the board, old blue eyes, the greatest entertainer of the 20th century. But the real Frank Sinatra, the deeply flawed man behind the microphone, was far more complex, far more ruthless, and far more tragically human than the legend suggests. Click the subscribe button now. We publish a completely new and previously untold Sinatra story every day, and you definitely won't want to miss future stories.